Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and essay grader, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free at achievable.me. And if you like it, the code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Travis Morgan from the MBA Whisperer. And Travis, I'd love if you can introduce yourself and your company.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Thanks for having me on. Um, yeah, I'm Travis Morgan. My company is called MBA Whisperer. I do both test prep and I do admissions consulting, primarily for MBA programs, although I do work a little bit in other programs as well on the admission side. I am a one-on-one tutor and I work on the GMAT, the GRE, and the executive assessment.
Yeah, great. And so today we're going to be talking about a trend that you see somewhat often, right? Or at least when we were talking about this, it's something that's never been covered on this podcast before, and I thought was really interesting, which is people switching tests, right?
Yeah,
There's for those of you who don't know, there's the GMAT and the GRE if you're applying to MBA programs. If you are applying to other types of graduate programs, you kind of have to take the GREs, but this is specific for MBA applicants who often can choose between one or the other. And the interesting thing is like the GMAT is technically there. The GMAT is only for MBA applicants, right? So it's the one that's more focused on that vertical, and the GRE is more general. So what is the motive behind students switching from the GMAT to the GRE? Why does this even come up?
right. And a lot of students do start with the GMAT because it is kind of the default test if you're applying to business school. And
Hmm.
I think for good reason, quite frankly. Yeah, the business schools themselves, deans of the business schools are on the board of GMAC. And so they kind of tell GMAC what they're looking for and what they want in the exam. And so it's a little more tailored to business school. And
Hmm.
it is the most popular exam by far for people applying to business school. However, the schools are very clear that they do not have a preference on GMAT versus GRE. And so a lot of students will find themselves at some point or another in their studies saying, I just cannot seem to get this score higher. I'm looking for a stronger score to get into my target schools. And so they start exploring the GRE. And I have switched many, many students over from the GMAT to the GRE, often with very positive results, actually.
Hmm. Okay, and but why are they positive results then? I mean, is the test actually easier? Is it just better for a different type of test taker? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, the GMAT really rewards what I call cloud thinking, if you will, versus the GRE, where I tell people if you're a person who's more linear, where you're like, just tell me step by step how to do a problem, and I will do those steps, and I will do the problem, and I'll be able to solve it. The GRE tends to be a better option for them, quite frankly. And so,
Yeah.
um, especially on the quant, where it's the questions are just more straightforward, right? They aren't as quote unquote tricky. And again, this is by design on the GMAT that the GMAT is really trying to test more than just your ability to do the math problems. It's trying to test more of your higher level problem solving skills, your creative thinking skills, things like this. And so a big part of answering the question is figuring out what the question is even asking, and uh, then going in and using those fundamental quant skills to solve the problem after that. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And they find that the GRE is,
Mhm.
particularly GRE quant, is more comfortable for that kind of step by step linear problem solver.
Right. Yeah. And so you mentioned that GMAT rewards more like cloud thinking, right? Like what does that mean?
So I think of cloud thinking as, oh, I learned this thing in third grade, and then this other thing, just from my everyday life, and this over here, and I pull that all together, and oh wow, yeah, this works for this problem, this kind of thing, versus just having every formula memorized uh, and going into the exam fully knowing what questions they're going to ask you and just spitting it right back. Instead, it kind of requires a little bit more creative problem solving.
Right. Well, that's interesting too, because I mean, would you argue that, like, do you feel like business schools have a preference between the two, right? Because they do test different types of thinking, or do they kind of just treat them the same?
No, you'd think that they would have a preference, but they really genuinely don't. And so there is a dirty little secret too, in that the ranking that utilizes testing the most is US News and World Report. In fact, most of the other rankings don't incorporate average test scores at all. And US News
Mm,
and World Report, it's a pretty significant percentage of their ranking is the average test scores. But now that business schools accept more than one test, they need to figure out a way to normalize that data to equalize, the GMAT versus the GRE scores. And how they've
mm,
decided to do that is through percentiles. But if you think about the GRE, right, testing across all these different graduate programs, including humanities type programs that care very little about the quant scores. And, on the flip side, you might have engineering programs that care far less about the verbal scores. And
mm.
so it just turns out that because of this much broader pool of test takers, um, it's much easier to score a higher percentile on the GRE, especially on the quant, than it is on the GMAT. And so
Right.
if the rankings are using percentiles as their standard, so do the schools. And so it's actually because it's easier to get a higher percentile on the GRE, especially on the quant, than it is on the GMAT. There's actually kind of a sneaky little advantage to taking the GRE, especially if you're going to score below the school's averages. You want to take the GRE because the percentiles are in your favor.
Right. Yeah. No, we also noticed the same thing. I think the difference in percentile averaged across the top 14 business schools is something like 8%, which is like pretty substantial actually. It's
Right?
you out of 100, you can go from, an 85 to a 93, right? Like that's pretty good. Um, it's interesting though, so how much of this is so the schools don't really penalize you for taking the easier test, or maybe the test isn't easier so much as you're not just taking it with a bunch of other MBA applicants, you're taking it with, people that have just graduated college and are applying to like their master's program and things like that, right? So like you said, maybe they're not skewed as math heavy, things like that. But when it comes to, so, I understand in the context reasons, that makes a lot of sense. And then we've talked a little bit about the test itself reasons, right? Like the quant is a little bit easier for certain types of people. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more and talk about kind of what the key differences are between the two tests, both for the quant and the verbal. I think we can start with the quant. Um, for me, I think that you summarized it already, but the way that I would put it is basically the GMAT, you have to figure out what the problem is a lot more so than the GRE on the quant section. Um, and I feel like essentially, while probably in the business world, there's some merit to that being part of the test. I think that, for most people, it's a lot easier to just not have to have play a logic game or oh, what rule of geometry is this problem referencing that I forget, right? That's necessary to solve it kind of guessing game. I mean,
Right. Totally agree. Yep. Mm.
yeah, so I guess I'm curious, like, what do you see as the big differences between the GMAT and the GRE, particularly, like, starting with the quant? Yeah.
Sure. There are some content differences. So I will say that some of my folks, when I switch them over from the GMAT to the GRE, they're able to take the GRE within just 2 or 3 weeks, FYI. So the tests are
Oh, wow.
substantively similar. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of overlap. I'd say the couple of areas that you need to bone up on if you're switching from the GMAT to the GRE is that the GRE tests more in geometry now. GMAT Focus eliminated most geometry problems from the exam. They also test a lot more in data analytics. So things like normal curves and percentiles and quartiles and things like this are not tested on the GMAT and they are tested on the GRE. So these are some
Hmm.
areas to bone up on. And then there's also a question type that's different. So on the GMAT, there's a question type called
Hmm.
data sufficiency, um, where you have to
Right.
decide if a certain amount of data would get you to an answer. And on the GRE, there's a question type called quantitative comparison, and that is not
Hmm.
on the GMAT. So just getting accustomed to and having some strategies around quantitative comparison questions is a key thing that I work with my students on as we make that transition.
Right. And realistically, neither of these question types are like too hard, but I think people get intimidated by both of them. Right? Do you want to describe each one briefly just to kind of give people some context here?
Sure, you bet. And yeah, they're just unfamiliar, right? So it's intimidating when you have an unfamiliar question type. So on the GMAT, this data sufficiency question basically poses a question to you. It could be as simple as what is the value of x, or is x greater than 0,
Hmm.
something like this. Note that those two questions that I just gave, one of them asks you for a specific value, and the other one asks you a yes or no question, right? Is it greater than 0? The answer is either yes
Hmm.
or no. And then it will give you two statements and that have facts, that have information. And it essentially asks you, is statement one on its own sufficient? Is statement two on its own sufficient? Are each one on their own sufficient? Would you have to take them together? Or even if you take them together, it's still not going to be sufficient to answer the question at hand. And so that's just a different way of asking a math question. Usually we're accustomed to, what's the answer? And we just give you the answer. In this case, they're asking, do we have enough information to
Right.
get to an answer? And they specifically ask this because in business, often knowing how much information we need before we go and try to answer the question is an important thing because data is expensive. And so knowing how much data I would need to answer this business question is a valuable thing to ask. Yeah. So that's data sufficiency. Uh,
Yeah.
Go ahead. Mhm.
Oh no, I just
On
was
the
agreeing with you. I think it's
GRE
an
side of
interesting
things,
and good question.
yeah, yeah, no, it's a fascinating question type, I think. Yeah. Um, on the GRE side of things, we have the quantitative comparison, which still gives you two pieces of information. So it's kind of a similar looking problem. It'll ask you, um, the ultimate question is asking, is quantity A bigger or is quantity B bigger? Are they equal or we cannot determine? On the GMAT, we would call that not sufficient to answer the question, right? Cannot determine. And so you'll have these two quantities that you're offered, and often you'll be given some additional information about those quantities that you then use to determine whether one is bigger or the other.
Hmm. Got it. Okay. Yeah, and I think just in general, the funny thing is it mirrors the test like style, I guess, in that the GMAT question is like you're trying it's a more vague and you're almost doing a math question backwards,
Hmm.
right? Like you said. And then the GRE on the other hand, it's still like kind of a vague and obscure question. And it's still kind of testing the same thing, but just differently, right? Which is at the end of the day, they're both testing, do you have the information necessary to solve this problem, right?
Yes, but I agree that quantitative comparison is just a more straightforward question type. It's more straightforward. Is this one bigger? Is that one bigger? Right? And so you're not having to try to figure out what the question
Right.
is really asking.
Yeah. Well, great. And then I think other than that, I mean, most of the other stuff on the quant is pretty similar. Yeah.
Yes, one of the big differences that pretty easy to overcome is that GRE has some questions that you can select multiple answer choices, right? Multi-select, and so you have
Mhm.
multiple options. That's a little unfamiliar territory for GMAT test takers, so that's something to get used to is pay attention to the oval answer choices versus the square answer choices. But not a big, I mean, pretty easy to transition on that.
Yeah, that's not so bad. Well,
Mhm.
great. Then let's talk about the verbal. So, what's the big difference between the GMAT verbal and the GRE verbal? I mean, I think vocab is definitely one of them.
Absolutely. So this is the biggest stumbling block to people transitioning from the GMAT to the GRE, I would say, is the verbal section. So we have two question types that are identical. We have longer format reading comprehension questions with multiple questions attached to them. And what's called critical reasoning on the GMAT is sort of shorter format reading comprehension on the GRE with just one question attached to it. And those question types are just straight up identical from the GMAT to the GRE. Now on the GMAT, those are the only two question types. So I like to say every minute that you spent studying for the GMAT is applicable to the GRE, that you can just do a straight transition right over. However, there are two new question types or unique question types to the GRE. And that's sentence equivalence and text completion, and those are very vocab heavy. And so the very first thing that I do if we're going to have people transition from the GMAT to the GRE is I say, start working on that vocab. And there's a lot of
Mhm.
various resources out there, flashcards and apps and lists of words and things like this. And I can recommend resources based on the person's learning style and the sort of thing. But it's get starting boning up on that GRE vocab. It's going to be big, and we immediately start talking about strategies on both new question types. Say how should we be approaching this question type, that sort of thing, because it's the biggest stumbling block to that transition.
Yeah, and I mean, with our course, we have a number of strategies that we include. We do spaced repetition to make sure people are remembering the material and actually like remembering those vocab words.
Hmm.
And we also do like word clusters.
Yep.
But it's you can't possibly memorize all the vocab that you could see on the GRE.
Right.
um, you know, the scope of it is too big. So then the question is more just like, how do you nail all the obvious stuff, like the most commonly used vocab words, and then how do you infer the rest of it, right? Either through like like grouping things and kind of knowing what words in a group mean, or just like through word roots, or even just like, I don't know, kind of guess at a certain point.
Right, right. I One of the things that I really emphasize in moving from the GMAT to the GRE on the verbal is this willingness to pick an answer choice that you just don't know. You have no idea. But if, you're
Hmm.
leaning, let's say that I know, or I kind of think I know, what one of the words means, and I feel like, say it's on sentence equivalence, and I I feel like it's not a perfect fit with this other word. It's in the same direction, but it's not a perfect fit. Am I going to choose this word that I have a lot of hesitancy around, or am I going to choose a word that I just have no idea what it means? And we have a bias as human beings. We tend to push things away from us that we don't understand, right? And so
Hmm.
I think the GRE kind of plays off of that bias. And often sends us a word that's not really a great fit, but is one that we're going to understand more, versus a word that we just
Hmm.
have no idea what it means, and we're much more likely to gravitate toward things that we do know. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
counteracting that bias. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So then, other than that, what are the other major differences with the verbal question types between the two tests?
One that is just really to kind of get accustomed to is the format. Yeah, so
Hmm.
Um, on the reading comp, you're always going to have the passage on the left-hand side. You're always going to have the questions on the right-hand side, whether you have multiple questions attached to that or whether you only have one question attached to that. And I teach this as two totally different question types with two totally different strategies. And so getting accustomed
Hmm.
to looking up at the little blue bar above the passage to see is this multi-question or is this just one question, I think is a little a little adaptation, right? You know, that we have to get accustomed to. And then this idea on both, well, on both sentence equivalence, but also some of the reading comp questions where you could have multiple answer choices. Of course, with sentence equivalence, we always have two answer choices and getting used to that. But in the reading comp, having, you know, all of the answer choices could be correct potentially, and that is something that people really have to get used to.
Right. Yeah, and it's also like you said, it's like you have to get used to kind of the unknown, being willing to accept the unknown.
Yeah,
Do
and
you, do
that's
you think
an
that
uncomfortable thing for everyone, I feel like, right? We're always uncomfortable with what what we don't know.
do you feel like the GRE verbal is more or less difficult for people that English is not their first language?
Oh, it's such a great question. I tussle back and forth with this a little bit because I do work with a number of people for whom English is not their first language, and then I work with a lot of native English speakers. I have found that it's not necessarily a split on whether English is your first language or not. It's a split on how good you are at learning new vocabulary. and,
Hmm.
and sometimes uh, people for whom English is not their first language are actually really good at learning the new vocabulary, especially if their native language has similar um, core words, right? You know, has similar
Hmm.
roots, and so they'll know words, or they'll at least be able to make associations to words that my native English speakers have never heard of and don't understand at all, and they're like, oh, this sounds just like this in my native Spanish or something like this. So there actually can be an advantage on the GRE if you're not a native English speaker. Um,
Mm.
but on the flip side, it can. I mean, if your baseline vocabulary is not nearly as strong, and so even words that native English speakers would just know and they look at and you
Hmm.
are unfamiliar to you, that can be a pretty heavy lift, right? You know, in terms of
Hmm.
having to learn not only the words that my native English speakers are learning, but all of these other words that may not be part of your English vocabulary. That's a challenge,
Well,
and
they aren't part of our English vocabulary either,
right,
right?
many of them are not.
Like
Uh,
there's a lot of words that are very obscure, like $5 words that the GRE loves to
Absolutely.
throw in there.
Yeah, which, by the way, Tyler, I shouldn't even say this, but I'm just like, this is so ridiculous. Like, you know, I mean, I understand that this test is, is testing people who are going into a very broad array of, of uh, different graduate programs, but knowing these very obscure $5 words to me has very little to do with how well you're going to succeed in business school and in most other graduate programs. But it's just the price of
Yeah,
entry,
that's
isn't
that's a,
it?
that's a reasonable. Yeah, it's a reasonable take. I don't think I'm ever going to use any of those words that are in that I've seen in the GRE course.
Yep.
Um, yeah, so then from switching to the GMAT to the GRE,
Hmm.
one of the big things is you just lose, particularly if it's a GMAT focus,
Mm.
you just lose the whole integrated reasoning section in its entirety, right? Like there's just no equivalent to that for the GRE.
I
Do you feel like this is a good or a bad thing?
There are some overlaps. So in the quant section of the GRE, there's a lot more data analysis. So you're going to have charts, you're going to have graphs,
Right.
things like this, which you don't get as much on the GMAT quant, but you do get in integrated reasoning. So that is not wholly lost, but I do agree that
It's still pretty lightweight
it's
compared
lighter.
to the
Yeah, it's a lot lighter
integrated
on the
reasoning.
GRE.
Yeah.
Um, but the nice thing is, though, is if you have already been studying for the integrated reasoning style questions, the GRE is just going to feel like, oh, this is a breeze,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And
Much
that's not a
easier.
bad thing. Yeah, that's not a bad thing to have developed these skills a little bit more strongly, and then realize, oh wow, this is, these questions in the GRE. any bad at all.
Right. Well, so yeah, I mean, so far you presented a pretty nice case for people that if they're struggling with the GMAT, particularly the quant, that this is an interesting avenue for them to look into. Um, I'm curious what advice, other than like you've been giving little tidbits of advice throughout the episode, but what advice do you have for people that are maybe looking to make that switch from the GRE to the GMAT? Like, what do you tell students and just, yeah, what advice do you have?
Going the other direction. Yeah. So,
Oh, sorry. Not,
oh,
oh, I said that wrong. I meant like I wanted to wrap up first
got it.
GMAT to GRE, my bad, and talk about the advice there.
I'd say, my biggest piece of advice is that people tend to be too hesitant to switch. They feel like it's this sunk
Hmm.
cost. They're going to have to start all over, and that they push back on me for months, that they don't want to do it. And what I encourage
Right.
people to do is just take a practice exam. I mean, heck, these exams are way shorter than they used to be, right? It's not nearly as much of an investment in time as it was before.
Hmm.
To just take that practice exam and just see how it feels. Honestly, even if your equivalent score is about the same as what you were scoring on the GMAT, but it just feels more comfortable to you, you're just like, oh wow, this is my test. Like, yeah, I can tell that yeah, I just feel better in this exam. I encourage you to make the switch and just see how it goes. You can always switch back.
Right.
Yeah, there really is not a sunk cost. I say every minute that you spent studying for the GMAT is effective in studying for the GRE. And so if you try to make the switch and you're like, you know what? This vocab is just, I'm never going to get it. It is always going to be a roadblock. I'm going to go back to the GMAT. That time that you spent, on studying for the GRE is not going to be lost on the GMAT either. So yeah, don't be afraid. Yeah, give it a try and see how it feels.
Yeah, great. And then, yeah, I guess we can wrap up by just also talking about the reverse, right? What I touched on a little bit earlier on accident, which is doing, you mentioned that it's very rare to see people go from the GRE to the GMAT, but I'm curious if you have any, advice for people that are interested in doing that.
I do. And the number one reason why they go the other direction is the verbal, and so that they're really struggling
Hmm.
on especially the vocab heavy verbal question types. And they have strong underlying quant skills. Yeah, that their quant is stronger than their verbal, essentially.
Hmm.
And if we have that combination, especially now that the GMAT no longer has sentence correction, it only has critical reasoning and reading comprehension, then often the verbal section feels much more comfortable to them, and it's a lighter lift. There's less memorization. There's
Hmm.
quite frankly just less content, uh, um, and it's mostly your logical reasoning skills. And so if you've got strong logical
Right.
reasoning skills and strong quant skills, and you are kind of more of that figure outer, if you will, yeah, that you like to just kind of figure out puzzles and stuff like that. The GMAT actually might be a more comfortable exam for you, and you might perform really quite well on the GMAT. That
Hmm.
tends to be a much smaller segment of the population. But again, I
Hmm.
just recommend just take a practice exam and see how it feels. Take a free practice
Hmm.
exam. I always recommend the official exams of both
Yes. Yeah.
tests
Yeah.
because they're much more accurate than anything else out there. And yeah, take one and see how it feels. And if it feels comfortable to you, absolutely you can go the other direction. Just know that the quant is going to be a little heavier lift, but again, every single thing that you studied for the GRE is going to be applicable for the GMAT, with the exception of all of those $5 vocab words. So it's not a sunk cost. It's worth exploring if you're struggling with that vocab.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like really to kind of wrap up here, the advice and the solution is try both tests, figure out which test is best for you. If you're looking for maybe an advantage on your percentiles in the quant in particular, the GRE is statistically likely your better bet. If you're struggling with the vocab, then maybe the GMAT is the better bet. But in either case, you should just try both. And when you say try both, for the love of everything, please do not do some third party diagnostic test that's like 10 questions from each. Those things are not real diagnostics. Like, please do a real practice test from the makers of each, right? From ETS for GRE and from GMAT for the GMAT. They sell them online, right? It's like $40 for each of them or something. And this is determining which $100,000 business school you're going to go to. So it's probably worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, Tyler, I mean, I don't want to get into it, but some business schools, if you're just specifically applying to business school, some of them will accept an exam called the executive assessment, and we can probably have
Oh,
a
right. Which
whole.
is also by GMAT, right?
It is, and it's basically like GMAT light. Yeah, so it's just a
Mhm.
even more slimmed down version of the GMAT, and it's a very comfortable exam. Most of my students will say that the GRE is more comfortable than the GMAT, and the executive assessment is more comfortable yet. So, yeah, it's a user-friendly exam, and if your target schools accept it, I strongly recommend taking a look at the EA, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
a great tip to throw in there as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Travis Morgan from MBA Whisperer. And Achievable has a great online GRE course, and you can try it for free by going to achievable.me.